Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 118 called The Battle of Tours Poitiers AD 732. In this episode, I'm going to focus on one of the most famous battles in history, the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers as it's sometimes called, in 732. It's famous because some historians think it stopped the Arabs from conquering Europe. But others think its significance has been exaggerated, and even if the Arabs had won, they didn't intend to conquer Europe. So, in this episode, let's try to find out what really happened. We need to begin with Islam. I don't need to remind you that the most important event by far in the entire 7th century was the rise of Islam, and I suggest in its first 100 years after Muhammad's death in 632, there were two quite distinct phases. The first was the astonishingly rapid conquest of the Levant, Persia and Egypt in the 20 years after Muhammad's death by his successors in the Rashidun Caliphate. The second was the consolidation and continuation of these conquests by the Umayyad Caliphate. We've covered the first phase in previous episodes when I suggested that climatic changes in the late antique Little Ice Age may have contributed to the Arabs' astonishing success, besides the reasons we're already familiar with, such as the mutually destructive war between Rome and Persia from 602 to 628, plus religious divisions within the Roman Empire between Chalcedonians and Monophysites. Now, I want to spend more time on the Umayyad dynasty, which ruled for 90 years from 661 to 750 before it was overthrown by the Abbasids. You may remember that Muawiyah was the first of the Umayyads and failed to take Constantinople. But despite that, the Umayyad Caliphate extended the Islamic Empire in both East and West and was undeniably the greatest power on the planet. So, what was the secret of its success? I suggest three key reasons. The first was religious tolerance. As we've discussed in earlier episodes, the spread of Islam in the 7th century AD was a military phenomenon, not a religious one. Islam was neither thrust upon the conquered peoples of the Middle East, and nor did they clamour to convert. The hallmark of Arab government under the Umayyads continued to be religious toleration. The vast majority of the populations of the former provinces of the Roman Empire remained Christian for the century after they accepted Islamic rule. The same was true to a lesser extent in Persia, where Zoroastrianism was tolerated by the Arabs. This was similar to the growth of the Roman Republic when it tolerated the religions of conquered peoples, except for the Jews. Second was the army. While the warriors that defeated Roman Persia soon after Muhammad's death were mostly Bedouin tribesmen, the caliphs quickly established a professional army stationed in new garrison towns across the empire, very similar, I think, to the Roman legions who were placed in fortified camps along the frontiers of the empire. The newly founded garrison cities included Fustat in Egypt, which would become Cairo, Kufa and Basra in Iraq, and Mosul in Iran. The Arabs paid their soldiers in cash from the central treasury, just as the Romans had done. This was, in my view, one of the major differences between the Arabs and the Franks, since the Franks relied on a feudal system of service to the king whenever he wanted to raise an army for war. By the first quarter of the 8th century, the Arab army was divided into three main formations. The most powerful was in Syria, supporting the heart of the caliphate and centred on the Umayyad capital of Damascus. This army suffered heavy casualties when the Byzantine Emperor Leo III defeated it outside Constantinople over the winter of 717-718, which we covered in episode 113, but there was always a ready supply of new manpower, and it quickly recovered. Another large force was based along the eastern edge of the old Persian frontier in Khorasan. spearheading Islam's move into Central Asia. And the third was the largely Berber army that had conquered Spain and was now poised to invade the kingdom of the Franks. The third reason for Arab success, I suggest, was an efficient tax system. This was how they funded their large army. The Arabs were fortunate enough to have inherited from both the Romans and Sasanians a centralised tax system that was still working and less decayed than the Roman tax systems inherited by the Franks and Visigoths. The only changes they made were basically to favour Muslims over non-Muslims by ensuring Muslims paid less tax in the form, for example, of the zakat than their non-Muslim compatriots who paid the jizya. Let's now return to our narrative, focusing on the events leading to the Battle of Tours in 732. Unfortunately, it's not clear what the Umayyad strategy was in the West. While we know the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid, who ruled from 705 to 715, and who succeeded his famous father, Abdul al-Malik, 685 to 705, was set on taking Constantinople, his ambitions in the West remain vague. However, one Arab chronicler, writing long after the event, said that his governor in North Africa, Musa Nuzayr, wanted to march the Western Umayyad army through Spain, Gaul, Italy, and attack the Byzantines from the north. And I think such an ambition may well have existed among some of the Arab high command. Certainly, the opportunity for expansion in Gaul looked promising. The Arab army in Spain was well supported by large numbers of Berber tribesmen and had a formidable contingent of professional Arab soldiers. If Visigothic Spain had fallen so easily, why wouldn't the kingdom of the Franks do the same? And the political situation in Gaul seemed to favour the Arabs. In 732, when the Arabs launched their major invasion of Aquitaine, the Frankish kingdom was locked in an internecine conflict. Aquitaine had declared its independence of the Merovingian monarchs under the leadership of Duke Eudes. Eudes was a rising star in the barbarian West. Not only had he humiliated the Merovingians by proclaiming his independence, but in 721 he defeated an invading Muslim army outside Toulouse, killing its commander. Yet today, few people remember Eudes, or indeed the Caliph al-Walid, compared with the place in history taken by a Frankish warlord called Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer. He was Pippin II's illegitimate but capable son, and we need to consider his rise to power before the Battle of Tours. This began with the death of his father, Pippin II, in 714. Pippin II had managed his quasi-kingdom well, but since he was still nominally only the mayor of the palace, and officially still a servant of the Merovingian king Dagobert III, on his death his kingdom began to fall apart. In particular, the Neustrian nobility revolted against Austrasia, which had been Pippin's power base. There followed a civil war between Austrasia and Neustria, with the Neustrian nobles defeating their Austrasian counterparts in the forest of Compiègne in 715. This was further complicated by feuding between Pippin II's descendants. Pippin had been married to Plectrude, but both of her sons had died early, so he left no legitimate heirs. However, he did have Charles, who was an illegitimate son born to a Frankish nobleman, Alpeda. Not surprisingly, relations between Charles and Plectrude were strained, and she did everything she could to thwart his ambition to succeed his father as mayor of the palace. Indeed, she even put Charles in prison and ruled in her own right as regent to her grandson, Theodold. But Charles was not to be underestimated. He escaped from prison and assembled his own band of followers. We know little about his personality, although the medieval Chronicle of Saint-Denis, written in the 9th century, immortalised him with the nickname Martel in French or Hammer in English, with its description, quote, As a martel or hammer breaks and crushes iron, steel, and all other metals, so did he, i.e. Charles Martel, break up and crush his enemies." End quote. As his nickname implied, Charles was first and foremost a tough soldier. He won over the Austrasian nobility because of his prowess as a warrior. He relegated the resentful Plectrude to a convent, although he spared her life. A little like in the legend of King Arthur and his knights, Charles gathered around him his own personal army of devoted warriors. He used this as the core of a larger army that would win him victory after victory. Indeed, he never lost a battle. Ousting Plectrude and her grandson, he took over as mayor of the Palace of Austrasia, and in 716 he defeated the Neustrians at Amblève, near Cologne, and in 717 he followed this up with another victory at Vichy. Rather than set up a centralised government and army, Charles relied on his own personal charisma to inspire respect from the Frankish people. The French historian Pierre Richer has argued that it was during his lifetime that the tradition of vassalage grew in importance. The original Germanic tradition had been for free men to swear an oath to their lord. Clovis and the Merovingians changed this to become an oath to the king. But Charles Martel reverted it back to its original feudal form when he demanded that men swear allegiance to him personally. This meant he could call upon a large number of Frankish warriors devoted to him whenever he wanted. Contrary to what some historians have argued, this was not yet an army of armoured horsemen, the forerunners of the medieval knights, but it was closer to the original Frankish armies, comprising large numbers of foot soldiers. But whereas the Frankish armies that had, for example, invaded Italy in the 6th century and faced Belisarius's disciplined Roman horse archers were little more than a rabble, by the 8th century they were well organised and, most importantly, well equipped. For example, it was in the 7th and 8th centuries that Frankish steel production really took off. By Charles Martel's reign, Frankish swords were the envy of Western Eurasia. Called Ulfbert swords, they became renowned for their quality steel and craftsmanship. Large manufacturing centres existed, mainly centred in the Rhineland. Frankish swords were exported throughout Western Eurasia, even reaching the Islamic Empire, and in Scandinavia they became the prized possessions of the belligerent Norsemen, soon to be named the Vikings. Not only did Charles's army have excellent swords, but they also had far better armour than the Franks of old. They wore thick leather jackets, often covered in metal plates, simple cone-shaped metal helmets, and large wooden shields, which gave them protection in a fashion similar to the Roman legionaries or Greek hoplites. Between 716 and up to the Battle of Tours in 732, Charles moulded his new army into one of the best fighting forces in the world, ceaselessly engaged in a round of wars with the Franks' enemies, particularly the Frisians, Saxons and Thuringians. In the meantime, he played merry-go-round with the pathetic Merovingian kings, proclaiming first one and then another king, if they displeased him, until in 737, when his puppet Thierry III died, he didn't bother to replace him. No one even noticed. Let's stop there and return to the Arabs. In 732, the Umayyad governor of Spain, or Al-Andalus as the Arabs called it, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, who I will refer to hereafter simply as Al-Rahman, advanced with a substantial force of Berbers and Arabs across the western Pyrenees from Pamplona in northern Spain. This was an unusual route for an Arab army to take into France, since the Arab raids were normally made along the Mediterranean coast near Perpignan and Narbonne, which was the easiest route. But the reason for Al-Rahman's western passage of the Pyrenees was to subdue a Muslim rebel, Munuza, who had set up a principality in the south of Aquitaine in alliance with Duke Eudes of Aquitaine. Duke Eudes hoped this Muslim state would serve as a buffer region against the Umayyad Empire and had cemented the alliance by marrying his daughter Lampegia to Munuza. Unfortunately for Eudes, this backfired when Al-Rahman became suspicious of Munuza's alliance with a Christian ruler and decided to eliminate him. Al-Rahman had no problems defeating the rebellious Munuza, who is said to have jumped to his death from a cliff. Again, according to legend, the triumphant Al-Rahman captured his Aquitanian wife, Lampegia, and sent her to the Umayyad Caliph's harem in Damascus with her husband's head in a basket. In response, Eudes mustered his army. As I mentioned, he defeated the Arabs outside Narbonne in 721, and he must have hoped he could do it again. But this time, luck, or maybe numbers, were against him. Eudes met the Arabs outside Bordeaux and was soundly defeated. It was curtains for Eudes's independent Aquitaine. He had to eat humble pie and appeal to his arch-enemy and rival, Charles Martel, for help. When Charles heard of Eudes's appeal, I suspect he was both delighted at his rival's misfortune, but also apprehensive about meeting the Arabs in battle. Over the summer of 732, he put his efforts into mustering as large an army as he could, while the Muslims advanced deep into France, pillaging and destroying as they went. They sacked Agen and Savigny, and still the Arabs advanced. They targeted Christian abbeys and monasteries in particular, since these were famous for their wealth. Slowed down by the huge amount of booty they carried, they reached the town of Poitiers, which was well protected by stout Roman walls built in the 3rd century AD. They didn't stop to attack the town, but pillaged the rich abbey church of Saint-Hilaire, built outside the city walls and boasting enormous gold decorations paid for by King Clovis 2 centuries before. Their next destination was another abbey church, that of Saint-Martin, outside Tours, but before they reached it, they found their way was barred. Charles Martel and most of the Frankish army were waiting for them. We have only 2 contemporary accounts of the famous battle that ensued, and the most detailed is that contained in the Latin Chronicle of 754, probably the most important document for this entire period, and written by an anonymous author, as its title suggests, in Latin, who was probably a Romano-Visigoth living under Arab rule in Cordoba or Toledo. He describes the 2 armies manoeuvring for position for a week before battle was joined. Historians think the battle's location was somewhere between Poitiers and Tours, probably close to the river Vienne, giving rise to the modern confusion over whether to call it the Battle of Tours or Poitiers. There's also confusion over the exact date of the battle, which occurred at some point in October 732, with the traditional date being the 10th. The description of the fighting is brief, contained in only 2 sentences. Quote, "The northern peoples remained immobile like a wall, holding together like a glacier in the cold regions, and in the blink of an eye annihilated the Arabs with the sword. The peoples of Austrasia, i.e. the Franks, greater in number of soldiers and formidably armed, killed the king Abdel al-Rahman when they found him, striking him on the chest." End quote. Our only other contemporary account, from the pen of the so-called continuator of the Chronicle of Fredegar, also describes a spectacular victory. Quote, "Prince Charles, i.e. Charles Martel, boldly drew up his battle lines against the Arabs. With Christ's help he overturned their tents and hastened to grind them small in slaughter. The king, Abderrahman, referring in fact to Al-Rahman, having been killed, he destroyed them, driving forth the army he fought, and he won. End quote. We'll never know exactly what happened at the battle, but it seems likely that Charles Martel's battle-hardened army, standing disciplined in a shield wall, immobile like a wall, as described in the Chronicle of 754, withstood what was probably an Arab cavalry charge and perhaps the assault of Berber infantry. The Franks were probably more heavily armoured than the Arabs and Berbers, and probably more numerous as well, as indicated by the Chronicle of 754. In summary, they used their excellent Frankish swords to slaughter the Muslims and to kill Al-Rahman himself. It was a complete victory that resounded across Christendom, although the anonymous author of the Chronicle of 754 lamented the Franks' inability to follow up their victory by pursuing the defeated Arabs, and criticised them for stopping to ransack the Arab camp and take all its plunder. Perhaps he was hoping they would use their victory to liberate Spain. The news of the battle spread like wildfire across Christian Europe, as we know from the writings of the Venerable Bede, the Anglo-Saxon chronicler responsible for most of our knowledge about this obscure period of Dark Age British history, who wrote only a year or two after the battle in far-off Northumbria next to the Scottish border that, quote, "the Saracens who had devastated Gaul were punished for their perfidy," end quote. So, what was the real significance of the battle? Did it save Europe from conquest by the all-powerful Umayyad Empire, as the celebrated English historian Edward Gibbon wrote, somewhat tongue-in-cheek 1,000 years after the Frankish victory, that without it, quote, "the Arabian fleet might have sailed without a naval combat into the mouth of the River Thames. Perhaps the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the schools at Oxford," end quote. Or was it largely irrelevant? Just a large Arab raid that was defeated, and if Al-Rahman had won, he probably would have done no more than to return home with his booty, and the history of Europe would be largely unchanged. Some modern historians have suggested the latter, but I disagree with them. While Al-Rahman's defeat was not as decisive as the Arab defeat outside Constantinople in the winter of 717 to 718, nevertheless it marked the beginning of the fragmentation of Islamic power in the West. In 741, there was a huge Berber rebellion against the Arabs, partly inspired by the Frankish victory. Berber armies embracing an Islamic sect called the Kharijites destroyed the Umayyad armies in North Africa and Spain. Only a substantial Umayyad army sent from Syria was able to suppress most, but not all, of the rebellion, with independent Berber states surviving in Morocco. Spain itself would then break away from central Islamic control when the Umayyads were overthrown by the Abbasids in 750, and a refugee Umayyad prince set up the independent caliphate of Cordoba in 756. But the Battle of Tours didn't just mark the beginning of the decline of Islamic power in the West. It also proved decisive for the destiny of Charles Martel. Hailed as the hero who saved Christendom, he established a new dynasty that would transform the history of Europe, that of the Carolingians. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll continue with the rise of the Carolingians on the 13th of September. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.